Muy buenas tardes. Soy Francisco Serrano, el director general de la Fundación Telefónica. Inauguramos este nuevo espacio hace escasamente 13 días, me parece, el día 9. Lo digo porque todavía nos faltan ajustes, por ejemplo, la capacidad de convocatoria, que confiamos en resolverla pronto, ¿no? En todo caso, me alegra mucho inaugurar este ciclo, el primero que hacemos de conferencias monográficas, con la presencia... Están presentes esta tarde, en realidad... No, a mí no, a megafonía, no es un problema mío. Comenten que suban el nivel, por favor, de sonido. Digo que tenemos presentes no solamente a nuestro conferenciante de esta tarde, el profesor Neil Cox, sino también hemos tenido la suerte de que estén ya en Madrid el profesor Edward Sullivan de la Universidad de Nueva York y el comisario de la muestra cubista que presentamos en la planta cuarta y catedrático de la Universidad de Málaga, Eugenio Carmona. Bueno, el profesor Neil Cox, que es de la Universidad de Essex en el Reino Unido, es un reconocido internacionalmente especialista en el arte de las primeras décadas del siglo XX, especialmente en Francia. A mí me chocó que en su biografía, en su currículum, tiene intereses transversales, de modo que ha estudiado la fenomenología existencial con estudios de Bergson, de Heidegger, de Merleau-Ponty, de la Escuela de Frankfurt también. Ha comisariado y ha hecho publicaciones muy importantes sobre el bestiario de Picasso en el año 95, una monografía sobre Marcel Duchamp en el año 99, una monografía estrictamente dedicada al cubismo en el año 2000, ha comisariado una nueva exposición en el año 2009, creo, en la Galería Nacional de Edimburgo, sobre los Picasso y los juguetes para adultos, el cubismo como surrealismo, y si yo he entendido bien, está preparando un libro sobre una historia surrealista del arte bajo el lema la violencia literalmente como cultura. Me parece que es el título de esa obra en preparación. Tengo que agradecerles a todos ustedes su presencia y dar la bienvenida y el agradecimiento al señor Cox también. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Y lo siento, I have to speak to you in English. I will try to do so slowly, though the more excited I become, the more risk there is that I'll get faster. If I get too fast, you can tell me. Okay? Shout. I don't mind. Okay, so I want to talk today, or take a perspective on the exhibition upstairs and the key figure in that exhibition, Juan Gris, by thinking about his relationships to Pablo Picasso, who is an artist about whom I probably know more than I do about Juan Gris, but I'm pleased to say there's an expert, a true expert in Juan Gris here this evening, can help me along. I wanted to start by reading you a short sentence written by the American, in my view, highly pretentious and overrated author Gertrude Stein in 1925 in a little magazine called The Little Review. She said, "Juan Gris is a Spaniard. Juan Gris is a Spaniard and his pictures." This is classic Gertrude Stein, where you get this cadence of repeated phrases. Juan Gris is a Spaniard. Juan Gris is a Spaniard and his pictures. So I'm interested in the question as to whether or not the fact, of which none of us will dispute, that Juan Gris is a Spaniard, is also applicable to his pictures. Are Juan Gris's pictures Spanish pictures, although made in France? So, a question I want to sort of leave floating for us to consider. A related question would be the degree to which Juan Gris trades on his Spanishness, tries to capitalize on it in some way as an artist. Picasso certainly did that quite a lot. So on the left here, you can see Picasso's painting L'Aficionado, and on the right, Gris' work, The Bullfighter. Now that work on the right is a very rare example of an explicitly Spanish subject. It might be the only one. An explicitly Spanish subject in Gris' oeuvre. In Picasso's case, there are lots of Spanish forms of imagery. Bullfights are the most obvious. Guernica, just down the road, would be another. In the catalogue for this exhibition, Maria Jiménez Blanco suggests, I think she's here, suggests plausibly that we can define Gris's whole life by its relationship to cubism. And I think another question we can ask when we start the comparison with Picasso is, would we say that of Picasso? Would we say of Picasso that his whole life is defined, his whole career is defined by his relationship to cubism? We might say that, but I think we'd have to confront the question of Picasso's relationship to surrealism. And we'd have to try to think that through. Now, Picasso, of course, studied fine art. His trajectory as a young man was always to be an artist. He was a profoundly ambitious young man, and I think quite early on he knew he wanted to be a very successful modern artist. Gris has a different career trajectory. He studied maths, physics, engineering at a technical school in Madrid, though he did visit the Prado and formed the ambition to become an artist. Picasso launched his career as an artist in Paris in 1900, we could say, launched his career on that centre of modern art, settling there more or less definitively in 1901. Picasso did do some illustrations for magazines while in Barcelona, but he had nothing like the jobbing, paid work of being a cartoonist, a newspaper cartoonist or caricaturist that Gris did for quite a number of years, while Gris tried to develop his own career as an artist. So I want to go on from this initial point of comparison to look at a few moments in this lecture where I think we can say that the paths of these two artists either cross in reality, in historical reality, or where I think there is a relationship of some kind at play in their work. So I'm thinking, what did it mean to be a Spanish modern artist in Paris in the years before, during, and after World War I? Although Spanish imagery didn't play a significant role in the career of Juan Gris, it's certainly true that his Spanish nationality did, as we'll see in the context of World War I. Now, before I take a further step, I'm going to quote from this beautiful catalogue, which if you haven't purchased yet, shame on you. Eugenio Carmona, the commissario of the exhibition, who's done a wonderful job, writes something quite interesting in the helpful English bit of a translation of the catalogue that I just want to read to you. My interpreters are ready. Now, curiously, Picasso, in the middle of the 1950s, when he was in his 60s, stated to his young companion Francois Gillot that, quote, "Painting is never like prose, it is like poetry, written with plastic rhymes." This statement, Carmona continues, consists of three phrases, all three of which come from Greece. Kahnweiler pointed out that Picasso had kept the manuscript of Kahnweiler's book on Juan Gris for a very long time. So Kahnweiler, Daniel Henri Kahnweiler, who became Juan Gris's most important intellectual confidant, as well as his dealer, and was also Picasso's dealer, had supplied Picasso with a manuscript version of his book on Juan Gris, his very important book, and Picasso had hung on to it for ages, which is a typical piece of Picasso behaviour. And Picasso later commented at length on the published text. Why, Carmona asks, after always having denied Greece his hospitality, his recognition, and his affection, did Picasso, in the fullness of his maturity, use words and categories of Greece's when the time came to define his love of painting? I think it's a really good question. Unfortunately, the answer might be rather trivial, which is that Picasso was not a very nice man. I don't think he was particularly. But it does reveal something about how Picasso came to see Juan Gris later in his life. It's part of a pattern in Picasso's statements about the Cubist period, that comment. And I think it tells us something about the way Picasso grasped the significance of Greece's achievement, both because he's praising it in a backhanded way by using Greece's language, but also because I think Picasso felt passionately that this artist's achievement had to be understood. And I'll come back to that point towards the end as a rather interesting anecdote to finish with. So I thought I'd start at the end and talk about the death of Juan Gris. Just as a little overture. 11th May 1927, there was quite a large gathering at the funeral of this artist, including another great critic supporter, Maurice Reynal, Daniel Henri Kahnweiler, Pablo Picasso, and of course the artist's wife, Josette, and son, Georges González Gris. Georges Braque was there too, the other co-inventor of the language of Cubism, as was Gertrude Stein. How did Picasso react to the death of Juan Gris? Gertrude Stein tells another sort of unflattering anecdote about how he reacted, where she told him afterwards he didn't understand Juan Gris, she didn't know why he was there, he had no right to mourn, and he said, yes, I do understand Juan Gris, it just went on like that. It wasn't a very edifying exchange, I don't think, after the funeral. More interestingly, Picasso, when artists die close to him, or artists he respects, there'll normally be a step where he makes a mourning painting. He'll make some kind of gesture in his work to memorialise that artist. There are lots of examples of this in Picasso's career. For example, Three Dancers, or The Dance in Tate in London of 1925, that was made as a sort of mourning painting for Ramon Pichot. There is no, as far as I know, nobody's identified a mourning painting for Juan Gris. Purely speculatively, I wondered about some of these rather grotesque, surreal Harlequin paintings made in 1927 as possible candidates, given that Greece had quite a protracted illness, so his death was not a surprise. So the timing, obviously with Picasso, is normally quite precise. It's normally the day after or something he does the morning painting. I think we might not be so sure in this case. Harlequins were a subject that they shared in the period after, or towards the end of the First World War and after. And this, I think, rather fine small painting might be a candidate for a morning picture. Notice this is an artist profile, probably, if you like, stand-in for Picasso. I think this is either a pad of paper or a canvas with the artist's hand drawing this strange creature who's become real. That's the surrealist gesture in the painting. Maybe Picasso's recalling that moment at that point of this harlequinade. So let's jump back to the beginning and to a place called the Bateau Lavoir, which means a floating laundry. Do you think I could steal that water? Nobody's going to stop me. The Bateau Lavoir was a shambolic studio building in Montmartre. Cheap studio building. It doesn't look very big from this side. On the other side, the hill goes down steeply and there's a huge range of studios that were rentable spaces. Picasso had his studio in this large complex. He'd had it since 1904, I think. When Greece arrived in Paris in 1906, we don't exactly know, I think, maybe you do, when Greece moved in. But sometime between 1906 and 1908, he moved in to a studio, more or less next door to Picasso. He was introduced by Daniel Vasquez Diaz. So Greece, who'd arrived from this technical training background in Paris, working as a cartoonist, was immediately plunged into this wholly new and exciting avant-garde context, meeting some of the great poets and critics that we identify now with the fostering of the avant-garde: Guillaume Apollinaire, Max Jacob, André Salmon, as well as Georges Braque. And certainly by 1908, Greece had also met Daniel-Henri Kahnweiler, who had been introduced to Picasso and de Braque and was about to sign contracts with them in the ensuing years. Now, Greece was in the early stages of an apprenticeship as a modern artist. The artists he was meeting were in full flow of making works of art designed to be ultra-modern, to challenge all sorts of conventions, both pictorial, moral, and cultural. The kind of thing Greece would certainly have seen in Picasso's studio included this, which I guess lots of people know, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. Now in New York, of course, we could now digress for a couple of hours discussing this picture, which has had exhaustive research conducted upon it, but we won't. Suffice it to say that this picture, Picasso finished it sometime like July 1907, and it then sort of sat in the studio for a long time, right through till 1916 before it was exhibited, and then it was eventually sold to the couturier Jacques Doucet through the intermediary work of André Breton, the leading surrealist poet in 1924 or so. Can't remember the date. So he saw that kind of picture in a studio like this. This is Picasso photographed in 1908 by the American journalist Gelett Burgess, surrounded by this wonderful stove and then various non-Western artifacts which Picasso had begun to collect, inspired to do so by André Derain, who he knew rather well. Greece would also have seen underway this large painting, Three Women, which is now in Russia. And there's a wonderful photograph here of Kees van Dongen's daughter, Dolly, standing in front of it in 1908 in Picasso's Bateau Lavoir studio. Now, living next door to Picasso, seeing Braque coming through all the time, Greece would have been witness to the rapid development of this very strange pictorial language that at this point had no name. This was just what these artists were doing. And we don't really know what the conversations were around such works. We don't have much evidence of that in terms of how Picasso and Braque might have spoken about these things. But Greece would have, to an extent, been party to those conversations. Picasso actually moved out of the Bateau Lavoir in 1909, though he moved back in 1911-12. He moved down the hill to somewhere more fashionable, and obviously then hankered after the sort of radical environment of the Bateau, the shabby environment of the Bateau Lavoir, and went back. So it's unclear to me how much Greece would have known and would have been able to follow the development, particularly since both Braque and Picasso spent time going back and forth to the south of France, whatever. So this work, which, I think T.J. Clarke, who's written a very long essay about this stuff, is right to say this is probably like the 0 degree of cubism. This is the point where it either reaches its pinnacle, if you like, or a kind of impossible moment of the near disappearance of any sense of representation. And that's happened really fast. That's happened by the summer of 1910. So we have a figure who is playing guitar, but who is represented by the most shimmering kind of and ineffable chiaroscuro, light, dark, that doesn't make any sense. We can't make that light and dark make sense to produce a figure very easily, and where if we concentrate on any single place, representation just disappears. And we have just the tiniest vestiges of the form of a guitar, of the shoulders and a head. I think Greece probably saw some of these kinds of things. He certainly saw, I would think, things like this, partly through his connection to Kahnweiler, and things like this. How did he react? What did Greece do? How did he begin to try to respond as a person who wanted to become an artist to artists who were doing this? Well, at first, in a way, we see him try to put himself through the most rapid training program, if you like. We're talking in the space of two years, doing a lot of drawings, producing, and I'm just showing you one there, a range of still life paintings that show him, as I say, moving very fast through steps in a pictorial language. So the difference between this and this is remarkable. I feel it's sort of under the pressure of, wanting to respond to that challenge of having seen these kinds of paintings. But it's already a very different language to even perhaps we might think it's close in some ways to that Picasso painting of the guitarist, but it's also a long way away. It's highly structured. We still have a strong sense of objects relative in space, and we have a strong sense of a kind of a gridding, a kind of rather rigorous structuring of the light and dark, striations, if you like, in the painting. Probably two pictures that were particularly important for Greece as he reached the point of going public as an artist. There are three of them, in fact. These are two of them. Picasso made a series of paintings of his dealers, 1909 to 10. These are, again, very, very well-known paintings, the Volard and the Kahnweiler. This Kahnweiler is an amazing picture. I should have done that, put it next to the photograph of him on which it's based, and you kind of realise how actually effective it is. Certainly this is a pretty good likeness of Ambroise Vollard when you see a photograph of him. And I think those two paintings became incredibly significant for Greece's plan to launch himself as a public modern artist. Because he did that, he's a bit like Jacques Derrida, who wrote 3 books and published them in 1967. So nobody's heard of Jacques Derrida, and suddenly there are 3 books out there. And Greece does something like that. I think he mounts a kind of coup with 3 pictures, which he exhibited in the Salon des Indépendants in 1912. Now, it's a well-established kind of interpretative framework for thinking about this situation, to say that on the one hand we've got Picasso and Braque, whose dealer is Kahnweiler, who make a positive decision, partly through Kahnweiler's advice, not to exhibit publicly. They exhibited very little. They kind of went into an elite sphere, if you like, over there. They were talked about, but their work could only be seen at Kahnweiler's very small gallery, which was probably not much bigger than that space there. At the same time, from 1910 onwards, there was an identifiable group of artists who had started to exhibit in these independent exhibitions, the Salon des Indépendants and the Salon d'automne, the autumn salon, who were garnering critical comment, and who began to themselves publish statements or to stimulate certain kinds of commentary from critics. So the idea that there was such a thing called cubism, or there was some kind of movement going on, was already established by the time Greece did this. And the fact that he painted and exhibited a picture called Homage to Picasso in 1912 was a very deliberate act to identify himself with these artists who were being talked about but who weren't exhibiting, to demonstrate his self-awareness as a modern artist, if you like, to connect himself to Picasso, and to, I guess, respond in a way, as I say, to those kinds of pictures that he'd seen Picasso making. Okay, I'll make a homage to the artists who made those great portraits. Picasso, as is well known, was apparently not terribly happy about this act of homage, to see himself paraded in the context of the independence as a kind of hero figure. This might not have been a group of artists he wanted to be associated with. And it's probably the first moment where we get the beginnings of this cooling of a relationship between Picasso and Greece that perpetuates right through the rest of their lives, probably. Greece also exhibited this impressive still life with flowers, with its painted border. Something which, if you look at a lot of the paintings in the exhibition upstairs, repeat this device of an inner frame. Perhaps comes in part from Seurat in the late 19th century, but certainly it's a device that Greece uses quite a lot. Okay, so maybe the homage to Picasso pays homage to Picasso's portrait of Vollard, as has been suggested. But it's also been noted that some of its visual characteristics come not from Picasso, but from this painting, which was regarded as a great success by Jean Metzinger. Metzinger had actually been quite close to Picasso around about 1910, knew quite a lot about his work, but had moved into becoming a public cubist, a proselytizer, an advocate of this new modern art, and so drifted away from Picasso's circle. This painting is, called Tea Time, Le Goûter, and what's interesting about it is how programmatic it is as a kind of demonstration of what cubism is. It's not what cubism is, in my view, but it tries to be that kind of demonstration. So, lots of undergraduates in lots of modern art courses around the world look at this teacup and see, on this side we see the teacup frontally, and on this side we see it from above. This is what Metzinger talked about as mobile perspective. He said, art must now capture what it is for us to move around the object. It is no longer good enough for art to be a window, like a photographic illusion of reality. We now have to somehow capture the experience of the object in time, as if we could see it from above and then see it from the side. It's like a code for that, as are the wonky eyes at the top, which of course Picasso makes much of all the way through his career, perhaps more effectively. But I mean, what's interesting to me is if you look at the top right-hand corner of the Greece and the top right-hand corner of the Metzinger, you can see quite similar devices at work. If Greece meant to make a homage like that there, he probably also meant to make this kind of homage with the still life with the guitar and flowers. This is Braque's still life with violin and picture, with its famous trompe-l'oeil nail at the top. I don't know if everyone can see that. So we have this incredible, consummate disruption of the idea of illusionism in art throughout the main body of the painting, but at the top there's a kind of joke of a nail banged into the top of the canvas, casting a shadow, like a phony illusionistic trick. So basically, Gris launches his career in 1912 with these very, very impressive and complex paintings. I'm going to come back to this one in a moment. And he follows that through in what was called the Salon de la Section d'Or, the Golden Section exhibition, in the autumn, with this painting and one or two others. This is called Man as a Cafe. And what's interesting about these things is that Greece very deliberately started using mathematical proportions in the construction of his paintings. So he was, almost ostentatiously using the golden section, as in the title of the exhibition, to work out some of the compositional structures in his works. For those who were talking about this would have been important. And it also reflected the fact that Greece began to move in different circles in this period. So he came to know groups of artists who were outside of central Paris, particularly the group of artists around the Duchamp brothers, Marcel Duchamp, Jacques Villon, Raymond Duchamp-Villon at Puteaux. And there was a lot of discussion about science, about a concept like the fourth dimension, about mathematics and so on. So Greece was beginning to move in those circles, and I think some of that sense of the idea that cubism could be systematized or could reflect a kind of rigorous intellectual practice, may be at work in some of these works. At the same time, it's very funny. It's a very comical picture with this rather comical boot or shoe down here. There's a streak of Greece's caricatural expertise in the work as well. So all of that moment was a distancing moment, in a way, between Picasso and Greece. Two cubists, one a public cubist, the other one not as such talking about cubism and privately exhibiting. But there is an incredibly productive dialogue in pictures that happens from the end of 1912 through 1913-14 that clearly reflects Greece's ability to tap into what Picasso was doing as a fellow artist signed up by Kahnweiler, which he was by this time. And this is the same painting we were just looking at, juxtaposed with another very, very famous object. This is Picasso's, this is actually the sheet metal guitar, I think, this one. There are two versions of this thing, which Picasso made in the autumn of 1912. The first one was made in cardboard and the second one in sheet metal. And it is a kind of relief sculpture. It's a completely new kind of object. There were not sculptures like this before Picasso and Braque made these kinds of things in 1912. It's a constructed, whimsical-looking, playful-looking thing, like a toy almost. But in fact, it plays a very complicated visual set of games with space and kind of oppositions of positives and negatives. Okay, it's juxtaposed with this thing because commonly it is now argued that aspects of what happens here depended on Picasso looking at this, which is a thing he bought in Marseille, an African mask, which he bought in the flea market. So people talk about this, the hole in the guitar, in the table of the guitar, is of course a tube, and the table of the guitar around it is virtual. So we get that's a positive-negative swap happening there. And I juxtapose it with this because Greece does something really interesting in this picture, which is not quite contemporary, but I think it's in a dialogue with this thinking, where the body of the guitar, that's, I take it, the hole in the guitar, but it's also a fruit dish with perhaps a piece of fruit in it. So we get a double meaning in the object. Now this productive exchange with Picasso's activity that we find in Greece has to do with the idea of collage or papier collé, the idea of integrating into the work of art foreign objects or materials. But the idea probably starts back here with Braque implementing in the corner of a painting like this the technique of faux wood graining, so painting something as if we're looking at a piece of wood. It was often claimed that he was able to do this because his grandfather was a painter decorator. And I don't know if you've ever been in apartment blocks where people had decorators' combs and they combed through varnish to make wood grain patterns or marbling patterns with a brush. So that's happening there. And of course also in this work we've got the integration of typography. Two radical steps in this practice. Picasso does this in May 1912, which is to make a tondo painting, still life with chair caning it's called, where he's collaged onto the painting, so integrated into an oil painting is some printed illusionistic cafe, paper. The kind of stuff they put on a cafe table that pretends to look like it's chair caning. He actually also had a rope frame made by a rope maker. So we get this kind of a sudden challenge being mounted between pictorial representation and, if you like, reality. I'll put reality in quotation marks. It's a reality being staged for us, the clash of the real and the painted illusion. And this reaches this logic reaches a really important point in September of 1912 when Braque went to a decorator's shop and bought some paper that had wood grain pattern on it and started cutting it up and sticking it onto paper and charcoal drawing over it. These are very dirty-looking little objects, in a way. They look careless. They look half-finished. But they're actually an incredibly important step in the logic of a disruption of representation. And what they do is they play metonymic games with the wood graining pattern and the representations here. So sometimes the wood will stand for space, sometimes it'll stand for a wall, sometimes it'll stand for the substance of a guitar or a bowl or something like that. Things move around in what they mean in these things, and that's what's really significant about it. So the real thing is made to mean different things. So then there are lots of examples of this. Is Picasso. Picasso was outraged that Braque had done this in secret while he was away from the south of France, and so he went at it like a train afterwards. He absolutely took this idea and went crazy with it. Here he's using newspaper to represent a violin. And again, it's possible to spend a lot of time talking about that, which we won't. I just wanted to show you how far it's going. Now, he's making something like this towards the end of 1912, and these things are being made at the same time and put on the wall with that cardboard guitar construction that I showed you earlier. So this is a guitar with some sheet music. Guitar is a musical instrument. We can read the music and hear it in the picture with a charcoal drawn glass, and down here a piece of newspaper. And what's important here, and we see Gries pick this up really well, he tunes into this, is punning with newspaper, that you can make jokes with it depending on how you cut it up. So this one famously, this is a newspaper called Le Journal, which I guess means the newspaper. It's not a very good name. The daily newspaper. And Picasso's cropped it so it says le jeu, like play, like half of the word play, or toy. And it says the battle begins. Now this is a reference to the Balkan War in the newspaper, but here it becomes, well, what battle has begun? Is it a battle about reality and art? Is it a battle between one group of artists and another group of artists? We don't know. But there's a suggestion of a pun, of a trick that we have to get. There's the newspaper that he cut up, and that makes you realise how deliberate it was. This poor man cut his wife's throat over here. He was cut out. So we do see Greece doing this relatively quickly. This is a slightly later example, 1914. A beautiful thing. I think these are stunning, these things. But what's great here is, right in the middle, he's got these explorers. These explorers. Who are the explorers? Are they explorers of space? Are they the great artist explorers of modernity? It's quite deliberate that that's sitting right in the middle of the picture. And we're meant to read it and play with it. I don't think we're meant to read these things literally for their content and think, okay, so there's a reference to the Balkan War, that means this, which some scholars do. I don't think that's right. I think we have to see it in the context of art. And this is from Le Matin, which was Greece's favourite newspaper, as is pointed out in the catalogue. Okay, so the guitar becomes a leitmotif in Greece's art, following this great burst of activity with Picasso making all kinds of guitars, cardboard ones, small cardboard ones, painted cardboard ones, papier-collé ones, half collage, half painted ones. And Greece goes into a sort of guitar phase. There are quite a lot of examples. They're very fine, I think. And this is probably another place where we can ask ourselves the question as to whether or not there's a Spanishness issue at stake in the guitar. Okay, I think the toreador, the bullfighter I showed you at the beginning, is the only explicitly Spanish subject. But Picasso and Greece talking to each other with guitars, maybe there's something at play there. This is clearly a reference here, isn't it, to the still life with chair caning, though it's painted. And that game starts very quickly, so you can collage things in, but you can also, this is collaged in, you know what, it's awfully difficult to tell as well, unless you've seen the real thing. I think that's collaged in. I think this is collaged in, but I'm not absolutely sure looking at that. And other things are definitely painted or pasted in from elsewhere. So you get a game going on, which is a performance as well, about illusion and reality. And the illusion and reality is both a play between the real object and the cubist interpretation of it, but also a play between making us think that something is real, pasted in when it's painted. And Greece is probably the supreme technician at this, of any of these artists. He does make some things which are closer to the spirit in which Picasso did some of these things, like this. A rather beautiful lime green guitar. Look at that lime green. What an incredible colour gesture that is. And that's another thing I didn't mention, but we get this burst of colour comes out of this practice of collage. But the marbling here is ridiculous. It's actually really gooey and not at all convincing. The collaged element is a little picture, and Greece famously said that if somebody buys it, they can swap the picture. It's an element that can be changed. I think the other work that has something of the less finished and the more deliberately rough textures that we get in Picasso's paintings and papier-collé and collages of this period is this one, which is in the exhibition. I think it's a really great piece, which is entirely painted. But we want to believe that that's collage. So we get that kind of play happening all the time. And here's one of these very, very fine, very precise paintings where Greece is using a tondo form. Again, that's something Picasso and Braque did as well. So I think at that moment there's a kind of an intense pictorial dialogue between Greece and Picasso, in particular, around the imagery of the guitar. The war breaks out in 1914, and both Picasso and Greece are not in Paris, they're both in the south of France. Picasso is in Avignon, and he famously said he put Braque on the train in Avignon to go off to the front, and I never saw him again, which was not true. What he meant was the Cubist moment is gone. The partnership is gone. That dream of whatever we were doing is gone. And I think that's another thing that informs the way he talks about Cubism in the 1950s, is a kind of nostalgia for that moment. Greece, and here's another great thing in the exhibition, probably my favourite. Greece was in the south of France at Collioure with Matisse, with Henri Matisse. I don't know, the scholars here might know, whether anyone's really written about this relationship very much between Matisse and Greece, because you'll know, but the Picasso-Greece connection is perhaps more obvious than the Matisse one. I think there's something quite rich to be thought about here. What I like about this is we see Greece inventing new compositional structures all the time in his art. And this is this weird, almost, I don't know how to describe it, it's like a strip composition, as if we're seeing something through shutters. And he does beautiful work with the newspaper. You can see if you look at the work upstairs in the gallery, this little piece of paper is lifting a little bit off the surface, and you can see that each of these pieces has been very carefully cut. This is a very careful cut here to create the sort of spatial drama. It's a very brilliantly constructed piece of work. We can see up the top, of course, some of that charcoal drawing, careful preparation work that goes on in the development of these complex works. So another one is in that mode. I'm interested in it because of these black strips. For the following reason. Now this is a painting that is painted in the period when Greece is close to Matisse. Matisse may have started this when Greece was there, I think he did. And we see that black strip running down there. So Greece is doing that in 1913, and Matisse does this. Did Matisse know what Greece was doing with this structure? I don't know. I've always thought this was a quite remarkable work. And I've always seen a relationship between it and a Picasso papier-collé, in fact. But it really struck me that, Matisse may be learning from Greece at this point. Certainly Greece becomes, I think, one of the best users of black in Cubism out there. And if you start looking at it, you can be very impressed by how he does what Matisse does here. So Matisse is able to paint a summer's day using black. This is a bright summer's day in the south of France. It's not some gloomy moment. We feel the iridescence of the heat and the light, but yet using that deep black in substantial parts of the painting. And Greece is able to do something like that, I think. When Picasso goes into black mode, it's much more morbid Spanish, if you don't mind me saying so. Like this. This looks like a somber, the war is coming painting, or Eva Goel, my partner is dying painting. It looks like it has that expressive characteristic in its blackness, even though it still has whimsy and play. But Greece is able to do that lightness of touch with black and use black as a powerful structural element without it overwhelming the tonality. So there's a dialogue, I believe there's a dialogue with Matisse happening. This is Picasso using a bit of black here. It's also up here, this is an amazingly elaborate still life. It's also up here for the pointillisme, the fake dotting that Picasso started to use, which we see Greece combining here with wonderful blackness. Again, rather joyful, in my view, blackness in this very complex book, pipe and glasses. The list of the titles are very unhelpful, of course, because, okay, we can see the book, the pipe, the glasses, there's one, must be another one somewhere, but it doesn't mention the wonderful coffee mill over here, the wooden coffee mill, what I take to be a coffee pot or a teapot there. You'd have to help me. There are definitely lots of real things in there, and they're all overlapping and integrating, quite difficult to unpick. The coffee mill features again responding to the pointillisme that Picasso had been playing with, using the black, but in a completely different kind of composition. This is what I think is so exciting about this period in Greece's work. Is that he's able to invent different compositional structures. They're entirely different, it seems to me. So we go from, this kind of structure to that, to that, to that. And this one, I was trying to think what the metaphor is, because I think these artists had to come up with pictorial metaphors. This one, a child's pop-up book, so you open it and some little figure. It feels a little bit like that to me, as if there's some complicated folded thing that could open up and stand up for us. So the coffee pot, if we look at how the coffee pot is represented, here's its drawer, there's the handle, and it's as if it's on different planes that are folded back on each other, as if they're zigzagging into space. This piece of paper here seems to stand up, and that one as well at the back. I think these are remarkable inventions of imagery fanning out and the structure being rethought. And we find the same thing here, a completely different image. And just to flag something which I think is mentioned in the catalogue, that this is an unusual composition because it shows a still life and an open window. So we have a combination of a vista in space and a still life. We might think that rhymes a little bit with that as well. So I think there's a lot of exchange between these artists, but who are finding very different pictorial solutions out of common practices. Now, I said the Spanishness thing becomes important in the war, and the reason for that is that both Greece and Picasso were, as Spaniards, neutral parties in the First World War. Unlike Braque, Apollinaire, Metzinger, the list is very long, French artists who went to the front. Matisse was too old, I think, by this point, to go into battle. So Picasso and Greece were two Spaniards who remained in Paris through the war. Well, they didn't start off in Paris, but they ended up there by 1915, 16. Picasso's trajectory during the war, there's been a lot of discussion about this, and he does things which I think are very, very difficult for Juan Gris to accept. And it comes out, I think, in some of the things that Gris says about Cubism in the post-war period. He starts to invent a different kind of Cubism, Picasso. This is the painting, well, you can guess, Harlequin of 1915, which Matisse admired, or at least ruefully admired, because he thought that the palette that appears in Picasso's work was ripped off. So here we have another artist profile on a palette, as we saw earlier on. But we see here Picasso simplifying the language of that planar, colourful cubism into something, well, almost theatrical and slightly grotesque as well. Rather strange, playing card effect. But what was particularly difficult, I think, for Greece was to see Picasso begin to treat Cubism as a style. And this is something that Juan Gris was absolutely not prepared to do. So, thinking of the comment that I started with, that for Gris his whole life was a relationship to Cubism, for Picasso's able to shift registers at this point and say, I can do Cubism, or I can do a kind of neoclassicism. So Cubism, for Picasso, the whole of Cubism becomes something he puts in quotation marks as a style. I can play this or I can play that game. Clearly the Cubism he's working with as well is very whimsical, sometimes decorative. This is quite a decorative looking painting with a kind of whimsical subject, these commedia dell'arte subjects becoming quite important. Gris, as I've already said, adopts that language, but for him it's always tied to an invention of Cubism, a reinvention of Cubism. Of course, it's the patterned clothing of Harlequin, which is a kind of checkerboard image in itself. And Picasso became a kind of public celebrity figure in this period. He was one of the first avant-garde artists to do design work for Diaghilev's Ballet Russe, for this ballet called Parade, staged in 1917 with a libretto by Jean Cocteau, music by Eric Satie. And again, Picasso set designs, and Picasso invited Juan Gris to come into rehearsals to see this stuff. His set designs were showing Cubism as a style. So here we've got a kind of Cubism in the costumes, but here we've got a sort of, again, weird neoclassicism, commedia dell'arte neoclassicism. The two things combined in the same project. Gris as I say, was not prepared to accept that stylistic vision of Cubism. But like Picasso, his Cubism went through significant transformations in the war period, and he was able to begin to make these kind of paintings that a critical discourse formed around these. A critical discourse formed around them gradually that said that here Gris is starting somehow with geometries, with shapes, and reaching realities, representations. This is a rather fine portrait of Grice's partner, Josette Grice. And I think it also is a kind of, possibly a position statement, a quasi-manifesto statement vis-à-vis some of the things that Picasso was doing. Picasso was making neoclassical portraits of his ballet dancer wife, Olga Koklova, in the same period. So Grice is showing, I will make a portrait of my wife that is a new kind of Cubist portrait, not not moving to that neoclassical language. Of course, Picasso, I think, is absorbing and in dialogue with these moves as well, as we can see here. I think Grice finds himself, vis-à-vis Picasso, in a kind of difficult position. Picasso is a very successful artist compared to him. Grice is actually in a very, very difficult position during the war. Daniel Henri Kahnweiler, their dealer, was a German, was exiled, had to go into exile, and all of his collection of all of the work that he'd been buying on contract from all these artists was sequestered by the French state. For Picasso, this was not good, but it was not a terribly damaging experience, since he was A, very wealthy already, B, able to sell privately quite often to people he wished to sell to, and lived very comfortably. Grice, on the other hand, for Grice, this was a disaster. It was an utter disaster. And he lived in very difficult circumstances during the war. So not only is Picasso challenging, in a way, the values that Grice holds dear about Cubism, he's also in a very different financial position. And this may be one of those periods where we wonder why Picasso didn't do more for his friend. We know that he helped him to sign a contract with Kahnweiler's usurper dealer, Léonce Rosenberg, though that contract was not very favourable to Johann Grice, and nothing like as favourable as Picasso's. Grice, nevertheless, became, in effect, the leader, a perceived leading artist of a new wave of Cubism in the stable of Léonce Rosenberg and his gallery of the modern effort, de l'effort moderne. So, how did this relationship end after the war? We know that there's one further kind of moment of artistic exchange where Picasso made these very decorative-looking paintings, small drawings, little watercolours, little cardboard sculptures as well, of a still life in a wind looking out over the Mediterranean at San Rafael. Picasso made this painting in 1919. And we know that Grice, in a way, took up that device of the idea of a Cubist still life before a vista of the sea, a distant landscape, quite vigorously in 1921, after he was recovering from the first bout of the illness that would basically kill him, the sort of chest infections. So he went to Bandol, and he made, I think there are about 6 of these, quite big, impressive, still life paintings looking out over the sea. This one from Tate, I think, does a lot of radical jumping with space. So we're deliberately half wondering whether the boat is a toy boat in the near space or whether it's in the sea. The other characteristic of these things is the faux swag. Well, Grice had used that in 1912, but it comes back quite often here, and particularly in the picture that's upstairs from 1923. We've got these rather crazy pink swags on either side. Again, there's a painted border around this work. Now, the thing about this period of Greece's art, after sort of 1923-4, there has been a lot of debate as to basically quality judgments about about the nature of the work. I have to say, I don't find the quality of the painting and the construction in these pictures of anything like the level of the stuff from 1915, which I particularly admire. That could be because I'm an ultra-modernist, and I just really like that sort of moment of cubism in the run-up to the First World War. I think one of the things that does interest me about these is their use of colour and their, what would we say, the sense that the whole thing is an imaginary image. Although they are objects and we can identify them as objects, I don't have any longer a sense that these objects could be grasped, be real, be in space. They are pictorial imaginings, and that in part I think underpins some of that critical discussion that happened with Kahnweiler and others who talked about somehow the relationship between Greece's art, conception and representation of the idea and the sensuous image, of the notion that what Greece was doing, this is how he described it, was to work from forms towards reality. So to work from shapes towards representation. He said from the universal to the particular. I think there are all kinds of problems with that, philosophically underpinned way of talking in thinking about these paintings, not least because the discourse of universals and particulars is one that, when we apply it to art, is already problematic. I think works of art are both particulars and universals as a whole, and trying to think about, in a way, Greece describing a process of construction of a work as capturing that is I think, perhaps problematic, but that's a whole other discussion. Towards the end of his life, Greece simplifies and simplifies. We find, this sense of an elemental world of colours and shapes becoming more and more dominant. The same iconography is there, the guitars and the sheet music and the room and the distant vista. But the sort of artifice, the sense of the framing of this thing, of it being almost like a decorative panel, becomes more dominant. Picasso, this is 1924, now in the Guggenheim in New York. Again, he's working with this vocabulary, but it's becoming here something quite other. It's becoming anthropomorphic. And that's why these things could work for the surrealists. I think they could see the guitar as a body, this is an eye. These objects are beginning to become animated by, if you like, desire. And after that, we are back to the beginning, and Juan Gris's funeral. So the only thing I want to say at the end, I promised I would come back to the issue of Picasso's comments in 1950 that I quoted from your essay in the catalogue. And there's a nice story about Picasso looking at, if I can find it, there we are, this portrait of Josette, when it belonged to the very wealthy British collector Douglas Cooper in his chateau in the south of France. Cooper's toy boy, as we say, was, is that okay, Toy Boy? Can you translate that? Was John Richardson, who's now Picasso's most important biographer. So Richardson tells us the story of Picasso coming to visit Cooper and looking at this painting on the wall, and Richardson says devouring it with his eyes and talking about it and wanting to persuade Cooper perhaps to sell it to him. Picasso, in other words, I think understood the seriousness of achievement with which Greece pursued the values of Cubism. And he knew, in part, I think there's an ethical challenge to him as much as an artistic one, that he had taken a different path in his career. So maybe in the end Greece won morally, if not financially in this game. Okay, that's it. Thank you. Do you want? I'm standing here in case anyone wants to ask a question, but I'm very happy to stop. Somebody does want to ask a question.
Were they really friends in life, or?
Sorry?
If they were friends in real life, or were they more like frenemies?
I think friendships are complicated. Yes, they were friends, but Picasso was quite a difficult person to be friends with, and there are many examples of abandoned friends in Picasso's career. He was also very generous towards some people. Richardson says in his third volume of biography that Picasso always treated artists whom he considered as good as him badly, and artists who he thought were inferior well. Richardson says things like that. He's not very balanced sometimes in some of these remarks, but there is a pattern of Picasso moving through different friendships. Poets are an interesting example of poets who are friends for long periods, and then a different poet will be a friend. He lived a long time. He moved through many different circles. I don't think he had my understanding, I don't know what your view would be, I wouldn't say that he had a strong friendship with Juan Gris. I think he regarded him as an upstart. Good English word.
When you mentioned about the war...
I think you have to speak in a microphone.
Thank you. When you mentioned about the war, that Picasso was already a rich man, very well known, so was his work, and Juan Gris had a very difficult moment. I don't know what you were referring to.
Financially, mainly.
Yes, well, you mentioned financially, but there was a link between Kahnweiler and something you mentioned about being German and so forth.
I probably did that a bit quickly. Kahnweiler, as a German, had to leave France, and all of his property was sequestered by the state. Greece was dependent on his contract with Kahnweiler. So the contracts these artists signed were to produce a certain number of canvases size 20 or whatever. They were quite funny contracts, per month, in return for a stipend, a monthly salary in a way. And Kahnweiler would then accession all this stock and sell it as and when. He was a clever dealer, he knew how to work it, and but also really believed in his artists and was quite an intellectual. I think they valued him as a dealer. That relationship.
I just thought that he was probably sick or something.
No. It was the fact that income was cut off for him, and unlike Picasso, he wasn't the kind of artist who could sell all his work. When there were sales of Kahnweiler's stock and other German dealers' stock after the war, Grice's works, most of the Cubist works sold very cheaply, but Greece virtually for nothing, I think. That's right, isn't it? So... And that tells you about...
It's the moment to buy.
a market position.
Yeah.
Thank
you.
Very low price. You could have got a bargain.
Yeah.
And in fact, André Breton, Louis Aragon, other surrealists did get bargains in that period. They bought some beautiful papier-collé, Braque and Picasso things in those sales very, very cheaply. And I think Kahnweiler bought back some of his own stuff then as well.
Thank you.
This was a very interesting and, I think, thorough analysis of Juan Gris. And what strikes me most, more than anything else, is his unrelenting classicism and his singularity of vision. And I think it is Juan Gris who obviously opens the door for and makes possible the purists, Metzinger, André Lotte, and even into Fernand Léger. Mm-hmm. And so he moves into a totally different direction from what Picasso does. And Picasso is probably tired of that when Juan Gris continues to have that, to be very single-minded. It's also very interesting to see how Juan Gris, more than Picasso, was important for some of the foreign artists living in Paris in the interwar years. And I will talk, for example, tomorrow about certain artists from Latin America, among them, very, very briefly, Emilio Petrucci from Argentina, who much more than Picasso was interested in Juan Gris. And I think that that classicism, all of these Latin Americans and artists from other parts of Europe had been trained in a very clear and very traditional classic tradition, and I think were perhaps therefore very drawn more to the protean and difficult to understand Picasso, and drawn much more to the clear trajectory of Juan Gris.
Yeah.
I don't know if you would agree with that.
I think that's right. I mean, the only bit that I wanted to sort of follow up on that in a discussion sense is really that term classicism, which, you know, was definitely a part of the Rosenberg discourse, the idea of a new traditional cubism, of a classicizing of cubism, and the way Gris was talked about was as the great purifier, as the great rationalist in a way of cubism, that he could sort out the chaos of what Picasso and Braque did and make it into a classic kind of French art. But although a Spaniard, but I think that I also wonder whether by classicism we mean something about his procedure, his technical complexity. That there are different values attached to that word, and I'm not sure how these different artists for whom he was an important figurehead, where they found their point of insertion into that sort of nebulous concept.
I think there's one word that may explain which was exactly the point where everybody was mixing.
You have to speak in a microphone.
Structure.
No, bueno, lo digo en castellano y me traducen. Yo creo que hay una palabra que a lo mejor es la que mejor resume el punto en el que todos podían coincidir, que es la palabra estructura. Structure. Esa era la palabra perfecta para los puristas, lo era también para los que estaban intentando refinar el cubismo de manera que pudiera servir a la teoría del retorno al orden y al mismo tiempo a la modernidad. Creo que la palabra estructura servía incluso también desde el lado español para los noucentistas catalanes, servía para todos realmente, esa era la palabra clave.
And the word structure, you sort of have to ask
estructura,
yourself,
perdón, quiere decir también arquitectura, claro.
Yeah. Architecture, which is a word you used,
claro,
in the essay.
Claro.
Yeah.
Es la palabra que usa el propio Gris cuando dice que su pintura es arquitectura plana y coloreada, ¿no?
Sí.
Flat architecture, flat and colored.
And so it's interesting to see if we think about that if that was the touchstone concept or word for thinking about Gris's approach or his rationalization. It's good to think about the way Kahnweiler tried to describe what Picasso and Braque were doing, and then to ask yourself the question, why did Kahnweiler actually find Greece the most important artist in the end, you know? And it's partly because these things are they're very tricky to describe.
Yeah.
They're deliberately obtuse. They're deliberately resisting forms of critical discourse that were available at the time. So Kahnweiler, some of what he does, you know, he tries to apply German idealist philosophy to it. He tries to apply Heinrich Wörflin, some of his categories from the principle of art history to this. So he talks about Picasso piercing the closed form, opening the form, which is a Wörflinian opposition. Well, yeah, but you know, it's hardly getting a foothold, it seems to me, on what's going on. And I like the way that John Golding, who wrote probably the first and in some ways the best formal history of Cubism, and published in 1958-9. The second edition of that appeared in 1988, and he says in the preface, "I used to think I understood Cubism. The more I look at it, the less I do." and you know, he was very focused on this stuff, which I think is still problematic. And there are a number of... That must be the bell. There are a number of different, very, very elaborate attempts to read this stuff, and you still think at the end, well, has that really said it? And perhaps it's the wrong approach to attempt to capture them. Anyway.
Bueno, sí, yo creo que para entender esto hay que releer a Kahnweiler. En el catálogo hemos intentado introducir textos de Kahnweiler que son muy poco conocidos. ¿Por qué Kahnweiler acaba prefiriendo a Gris quizás un poco sobre Picasso en el terreno del cubismo? Creo que aparece con cierta claridad en las cartas que escribe a Einstein en los años 20. Luego Kahnweiler intenta ocultar estas opiniones, porque supone una apertura a tener que admitir a los demás cubistas. Creo que el profesor Sullivan ha dicho algo que está contenido en tu conferencia, que es muy importante en Gris. Gris significa el carrefour de unión de unos cubistas con otros que en teoría eran antagónicos. Gris hace posible que sean reconciliables. Gris se relaciona con Matisse, y en teoría Picasso y Matisse eran irreconciliables, pero Gris hace posible la relación entre cubismo y fauvismo, que en teoría eran dos posiciones que no podían relacionarse. Y creo que esta complejidad de la posición de Gris llegó a asustar un poco a Kahnweiler, que dice unas cosas de Gris en el año 20, otra cosa en el año 29, otra cosa en el año 46. Pero es simplemente una sugerencia. Y luego, como una anécdota, y no quiero cansarte más, lo que voy a decir a continuación parece una broma, pero no lo es. Creo que si fuerais malagueños, como yo y como Picasso, entenderíais la relación que existió entre Picasso y Gris. Es muy importante no olvidar que Picasso, a pesar de todo, y sobre todo por influencia con su madre, tengo este plano de comprensión psicologista de Picasso, ¿no? No lo puedo evitar, ¿no? Tenía un espíritu que otro malagueño ilustre, no conocido, que se llama Bergamín, llamó el espíritu de chufla, que consiste precisamente en intentar por todos los medios hundir, derrotar, arrastrar por el suelo a aquel que se admira. Que es lo que decía Richardson. Esto, ¿por qué ocurre? No lo sé. Yo he pagado mucho dinero en psicoanalista para poder superarlo, pero existe. Existe. Es lo que Bergamín llamaba la chufla, y creo que esto es interesante. Creo que además hay otra relación, que es que Picasso es andaluz catalán, y Gris es castellano. Y esto, aunque sea triste y pesado, en España es muy importante. No es como ser escocés y ser galés. Es como, no sé, es como ser de Texas o ser de Boston, que no es lo mismo, ¿no? O sea, pues, y entonces, pues, y eso pesaba, ¿no? En fin, no hablo más.
Yeah. So we need a finer grained sense of Spanishness in thinking about this comparison. Yeah. That's the best I can do in comprehending everything you said, but I think I got that. Yeah. Okay. We finished? Okay.